Well, I know most attention spans are at their sell-by date, and we're just before lunch, so I'm going to keep this short and really just touch on some of the noise-related issues that could be relevant to you. Now, I'm not an occupational medical practitioner, and I think just give me a show of hands, how many of you are not? In other words, you're level 2s, but you are not occupational medical practitioners. Please raise your hands. Okay, so at least I still have some colleagues left of a dying breed. So with a deficit of not having that orientation, please tolerate perhaps some of the aspects that would be obvious to those who are, but maybe helpful to those who are not. Noise is a major part, and in fact occupational related or noise induced hearing loss is a major topic, and not because we're successful in dealing with it, but because we fail. And so it comes as no surprise that not only are we failing miserably in diving as well, but the options we have to overcome our failure are extremely limited. And so there seems to be a shift towards almost tolerating the amount of noise-induced hearing loss that divers do get, and shift towards the compensation that they'll eventually need to get as a result, rather than trying to sharpen up our prevention strategies. Having said that, we should not limit the protection strategies we use in air or gas environments, or under the associated activities that are not diving related and are not subject to all the complications of earplugs in water, which is actually one of the major issues we're dealing with. Now, what is noise? Well, noise is basically any unwanted sound. And it can be complex, multi-frequency, continuing, fluctuating, it can be intermittent, it can be impulse, and of course a variable duration and spectrum. And how we measure sound intensity is to convert the force of the intensity to a pressure. And that's how the decibel scale is derived. We derive the square root of the force or the intensity, and that gives us pressure. Now, we actually have a range of 100 million increments of sound pressure. So if we were to derive a linear scale of the range of human hearing, we would have 100 million units of bells, which clearly are impractical, and therefore we use a logarithmic scale, the decibel, not only because it's convenient, but also because it actually approximates changes or perceptive changes of hearing. So it sounds to us between 10 and 20 decibels as if the sound intensity is doubled, even though it actually means it's increased 100-fold, for instance. Okay? So the decibel scale is practical, and it also represents, or closely represents, the perception of sound. So we convert noise to pressure, and we then use a logarithmic scale, and in the case of hearing, we compare the sound pressure, if you like, to what is considered the normal hearing threshold, which is 20 micropascals. So that's from where we actually measure a person's perception of sound. It's not a vacuum. We start at 20 micropascals, and it's designated, if you look at tests, as normal hearing level. If we're using machines, we can arbitrarily choose whatever the baseline is we want to measure from. Now, all sounds like Animal Farm, not all noises are equal, some are more equal than others. And so in the case of humans, of course, there are certain frequencies that are very relevant to our quality of life and human communication. So measuring the full range of potential noises is not as strategic as measuring those that would not only interfere with our capacity to hear, but actually affect our ability to communicate and live within the typical human communication environment and social environment. And so the way this is dealt with mechanically, if you like, is to filter out and essentially measure those frequencies that are relevant to human hearing. And those are called, or it is called, that process is called A-weighting. A-weighting. Now, in addition to determining which frequencies are relevant to us, noise is typically variable. So how do we then ultimately determine what has been our exposure? And the process to do that is essentially to calculate the equivalent continuous sound pressure level, which is again weighted for the relevant frequencies, which in a simple way would be to say we derive the area under the curve. Here's the variable noise, that's over time. So we dumb that down using an integration formula to give us an exposure, or an equivalent exposure time at a particular noise level. And using that, the literature has, or the evidence has shown that we are able to tolerate 8 hours equivalent of exposure to 85 decibel noise. So in other words, if your calculation produces a value, there are limitations, of course, if you have outliers of extreme noise, but if you average out an 8-hour exposure to the equivalent of 85 decibels, you are within the threshold in which hearing protection would not necessarily be necessary to conserve hearing. But if you're over that, then hearing protection would be required or would be appropriate. Now, just to give you a sense of the scale, if the averaged exposure is not to 85 but to 88 decibels, the tolerable threshold now becomes 4 hours. So even though the sound intensity only increased from 85 to 88, the exposure limit has halved from 8 to 4. So we must just bear that in mind, because it's very easy to think, well, 85, 90, is that really so much of a problem? But we need to realize that the time is halved for every 3 decibels that exposure threshold goes up. So if it is, what do we do? Well, we've got 3 strategies. We either isolate the noise, or we isolate the people physically from the environment or limit their exposure, and if we can't do that, well, we need to protect them. So that's the personal protection strategies. And there are specific design specifications of how these are produced. I won't bore you with that, but basically all of these are hearing protection devices. So you've got circumoral, supraoral, intraoral, disposable, reusable, custom-made. And the custom-made ones are actually essentially designed for 2 reasons. One is so that they actually work. In other words, in the noise environment that you're exposed to, that they actually do offer you the attenuation you need to remain within the 85 decibel exposure limit. And secondly, that they actually can sometimes still permit communication. So in other words, you get just the amount of attenuation while still facilitating communication. And these are fairly sophisticated design systems, the most important aspect being they fit. They actually fit. Now, of course, people lose them and they're quite expensive, so it becomes a bit frustrating to actually handle these depending on the compliance of your workforce. Now, the way in which we determine how well we're doing or how badly we're doing is, of course, by monitoring or doing surveillance. And there are different time points in which it should be done. Legislation requires we should do a baseline on everybody, and that is where many things fall short. There should be annual screening, and if people are exposed to a noisy environment, there are actually specific requirements for active monitoring. In other words, it's not a matter of every year seeing if the audiogram is worse, but you actually need to actively monitor. When a person leaves the occupation, there's actually a requirement to repeat the audiogram, and if you find something abnormal, of course, you refer for a diagnostic audiogram. And if you've lost more than 10% of your hearing level, your previous hearing level, it's actually compensable. So it actually would meet the requirements for compensation, as I understand it, of the COID Act. Now, where it becomes a problem for us guys that are still, in the fitness to dive category and not in occupational health, is that we have a different attitude towards it. Basically, if the diver can answer a question you ask with your hand in front of, your mouth, they're probably fit to dive. But you have not met your moral obligation to see whether their hearing is actually conserved or whether appropriate protection strategies are in place. So there's a tremendous shift between this fitness to dive paradigm, which is a whisper test or a very crude test, to the occupational health and safety requirements, which are actually for audiograms. And this is a part that we probably need to resolve better than we have. If you've got a company that's got a defined occupational health support, that should happen. But the stragglers and the free-for-all and sort of do-it-yourself divers, they are almost never monitored. And we basically just do audiograms and watch them, like a patient monitoring their blood pressure till they're pulseless. At which point do you intervene? And how would you even know to do it? So I think that's something we should discuss. I spoke about the difference between protecting people and paying them for your failures. So there are those 2 aspects of the law. And within the prevention paradigm, of course, there is not only the requirement for protection, but there's also the requirement for the qualification of the person who may do an audiogram. And maybe it comes as no surprise to you, but unless you're an occupational diplomat or an occupational nurse or an ENT, you're not legally competent to do an audiogram. You're not legally competent to do it. So, that's the one part of it. The second thing is that if you are competent, what do you do with the results? Because now you need to respond to what you find. There's obviously the requirement of the employer and the employee, and I won't get into all of that. Jack has done a great job about that. Then there are the regulations not only under the occupational health and safety, but the mine health and safety. And the mine health and safety already has defined a number of things, amongst others, that you have to be an occupational medical practitioner. You can't just be a diving medical practitioner to see these people. So then technically you would be qualified to do audiograms. There are other aspects, environmental regulations that define how do you determine noise zones, what level of protection, etc., etc. I'm just listing these. You'll have all the slides. I'm not going to dwell on that. And now we switch to where you failed and compensate people. There are various aspects of the COID Act, I think Schedule 3 as well, that also defines how people would be compensable. How effective people are in claiming this and how it actually happens, I don't have any data, but theoretically they are compensable. So in closing, let me just briefly mention some aspects related to diving and why it's so difficult to deal with this in the environment that we support. And that's because the ear isn't always dry. And a wet ear canal does not have the same dynamics as a dry ear canal. And even if it's dry, it's not necessarily air, and even if it's air, it's not necessarily one atmosphere. So you've got all these variables, wet or dry, helium, nitrogen, and anything in between, the effective density of gas, and then very importantly, the noise generated by the actual diving system. You'll see just now the study that came out recently that indicated that the exposure that already exceeded that 85 decibel 8-hour exposure was helmet or breathing noise. So in other words, before they even pick up a tool, being in a helmet already moves beyond the appropriate protection for hearing conservation. So we're failing before we start, at least in saturation diving settings. The activities and tools add to that, and don't forget the surface work that the divers also do, the compressor, cylinder high pressure gas release, chamber exposure, all of these things add up. What sort of headgear you're wearing and clothing, have you got neoprene covers, have you got essentially a headset inside the helmet versus just an open speaker? Are there resting periods? And what do we measure? You can't put a microphone in water. So how are you going to actually measure the exposure? I'd like to submit just an intriguing prospect that has not been explored, and of course there are potential complications of maybe iatrogenically increasing the incidence of swimmer's ear and so on. But I would be fascinated to consider the possibility of using DOCS Pro plugs, not only in terms of limiting water exposure, but also because it does actually attenuate noise. It's not perfect because it's fenestrated, but it actually does attenuate 15 to 23 decibels above 2 kilohertz. So something could be done. The point is whether it's going to be more of a nuisance than a help. And I can't answer that, but I leave that to this group to consider. Pretty much any diving regulator, including, of course, the Medical Advisory Committee, DMAC, insists that hearing conservation is necessary for diving. I mean, that's not an issue. John Ross has shown clearly that divers are more vulnerable to noise-induced hearing loss than surface equivalent workers. And this is the latest study that I was referring to in the UHM that basically said in operations between 30 and 120 meters on heliox, the self-noise already violated the threshold for hearing protection. So we know we've got a problem. The dilemma is we don't have a solution, at least not at the moment. Those are the references you can refer to just on background. And just to summarize it, it's a heavily legislated area. There is liability. There is a certain responsibility in terms of the employee and employer, but how they should comply with that in a diving environment is unclear. There are compulsory assessments that a competent person needs to do, and it's not only the pure tone audiogram that's important, but also speech audiometry. It's one thing to hear beep, 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 beep. It's another thing to actually hear or understand. People who lose hearing, they don't understand, because they don't hear the high frequencies that actually allow you to differentiate the words. And that's why it's so insidious. People can hear, but they don't understand because they've lost the high frequencies. That's why the speech audiometry is so important. And distortion product autoacoustic emissions, if you look at the presentation I told you about on the IDAN website, I get into that if you're interested. So a lot of work needs to be done. And that's about it that I have on this topic. Are there any questions, which I most likely will defer to the occupational health practitioners? Any questions? 5 minutes early.
Just contract workers versus permanent employees.
I think that's a very important question, because many of the people we deal with are freelance divers. It's scary if you read this definition. So this is the Compensation Act, and all employees are eligible to receive compensation. And this is the definition of an employee. An employee means a person who is entered into a works under a contract of service or apprenticeship or learnership with an employer, whether the contract is expressed or implied, oral or in writing, whether remuneration is calculated by time or by work done, whether it's in cash or in kind, and it includes a casual employee employed for the purpose of your business. It includes the director, etc. If a person is provided by a labor broker and you pay the labor broker, that person is your employee and eligible for compensation. If the person dies, a deceased employee, you've employed all his dependents. And it does not include the military, etc., if we are at war. If we are not at war, in other words, as defined in the Defence Act, if we're not at war, then they also get compensation. The only people who are excluded are people who do work themselves. So I am the employer and I employ myself. I clean the hull of my own yacht. And domestic employees employed in a private household. And that's defined as well. Everybody else gets compensation. So even a freelance diver, if he has the hearing loss, they can get compensation.
So one must do annual audiogram screening for divers.
If they are exposed to noise, I think there's a very strong case that all divers will be exposed to noise levels. I think that the evidence is overwhelming, although we can't measure it. If that the question is what the noise level is. If it's above 85, then it's an annual audiogram performed by a competent person. So that means employing at least an occupational health nurse to do it. Or if the level is above 105, then you need to do 6 monthly audiograms. And there might even be divers that actually require 6 monthly medicals. Yeah. So
the point is, a fitness to dive, a whisper test is enough.
Yes.
And an occupational medical requires an audiogram.
Yeah.
And
so if you only see a diver and say, I say that you are fit to dive, in other words, your hearing doesn't affect your work, a whisper test is enough. You don't need an audiogram to see whether you can hear enough. You can do it clinically. But to see whether the work affects the diver, that requires an audiogram. Yeah, so
if this act now, if you see a diver for the first time, he's 46 years old, he's been diving his whole life, you audiogram him, he's in a compensatable level, can he be submitted without any previous evidence?
Yeah, so the cutoff point was November 2003 was the last date to do baseline audiograms. If you don't have a baseline audiogram by November 2003, your baseline is taken as 00000, and there's no exit audiograms from the previous employers. In other words, the last employer will pay for all the hearing loss over the lifetime of that person.
But now the freelance diver is the
Well, in effect, it's going to be the compensation commissioner who's paying for that.
they will get paid.
Yeah, so the problem comes in submitting the employer's report because this employer is in the Middle East. That's another story. Yeah.
That's the story. Because we sit with the story every day.
The easiest solution is to tell the diver to get a local employer who is not up to date with it, and with baseline audiograms and those sort of things. So if you are the level 2 doctor, I would advise my diver to go and dive there because I know you're not screening and doing baseline audiograms, and then claim from you.
Is a compensation paid out?
Say again?
What currency is a compensation paid out?
Rand, yeah. And it's linked to your annual income. So you get 75% of your total annual income is 100% compensation. Total deafness in both years is 50% of the 75 of your annual salary. It can be substantial. It used to take 3, 4, 5 years to get the payouts. Now it's getting more and more efficient, at least.
What decibel is our cut-off point, and when do you tell a diver he can't dive anymore? He's deaf.
So we need to differentiate between the effect of noise on the diver or the work on the diver. That's compensation issues. But to say whether a diver is fit enough to work, you need to look at the inherent requirements of the job. So can he hear the instructions given to him? So a whisper test will probably tell you that. The question is, are there diving jobs where a deaf diver can dive and still do the work? I suspect there might be. So there's no cutoff point to say that you must be able to hear this level. It depends on what the inherent requirements are. The typical requirement is you're diving on surface apply, and therefore you need to be able to hear the instructions. If you can hear the instructions, that's good enough, if you can understand it. If you dive on scuba, how do you use your ears underwater? You can be deaf underwater, that's fine. But again, somebody must be able to shout to you, "Hey! Get out of there!" So at least there must be some hearing, I would say. But you can't say that if you are below, if you've got a hearing level of 60, it's not like in the aviation industry that you need to be able to hear alarms in the cockpit and things like that, where there might be a limit because they know what those levels are. In diving, it's specific to the job that you're doing. And if you're not fit enough for this one, well, just go and dive there. So a whisper test is more than enough to determine fitness for work, in my opinion.
You wouldn't fall in the group of being self-employed, because they're disqualified. It's basically employing themselves.
No. Our labor laws actually has got a definition, and I think it is in our code of practice. Let me quickly show you just the code of practice. So this is, I'm just taking one of them. This is the inshore code of practice, and there's one that says relationships. Employer and employee relationships, page 21. Any person who works for or renders services to the diving contractor, who is the employer, is presumed, until the contrary is proven, to the employee of the contractor, regardless of the form of the contract, including when freelance services are provided, if any one of the factors are present. The manner in which the person works is subject to the control of the contractor. The person's hours of work are subject to the control or director. So if I say, this is when you come, this is what you do, I give you the tools that you work for. If you are financially dependent on that contractor, then you've employed him. So self-employed literally means I'm diving and I'm working on my own vessel and nobody pays me. Then you're self-employed. But if you receive payment from any diving contractor, our code of practice says then that's your employee.
But the liability would not be on the fitness to dive assessor, it would be on the employer making sure that an occupational health examination's been done, including audiograms.
Remember the responsibility for doing audiograms because there is noise is not a doctor's responsibility. None of us is responsible for this. It's the responsibility of the employer. Some employers say, I'm going to employ you as a level 2 and I'm going to pay you every month so that you can take on this responsibility on my behalf. If you are employed like that, then you will be liable. Then it is your responsibility because you've been specifically employed in that position.
A lot of the driving companies now are insisting on them, not just having a driving medical, but they need an oil and gas medical.
Yes.
Apart from the oil and gas medical, there's an audiogram and
Yes.
working 2 years.
Yeah.
So they take the two in combination, they don't just accept driving medical anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's now, Jörg can attest to this, in Europe, the occupational medicine is getting major issues. The companies are saying that our diving doctors are not doing what we're paying them to do. They say the person is fit to dive, and then we get audited and people get compensation, etc., and we don't know where it's coming from because we've sent the guys, so it's a major issue. In fact, you can't do diving medicine in Europe unless you've got a qualification in occupational medicine. The reason why we can't implement it fully here yet is because in Europe you get a 2-week course and you're qualified. With us, the minimum legal requirement is a 2-year postgraduate diploma. So for us to say you have to have occupational medicine to do diving medicine is not practical yet. Yeah. But we're building critical mass definitely.
Jacques, when you do audiogram on a diver, you do it standard on all our divers audiogram, not a baseline audiogram, it's clinical audiogram. So now it comes out, you see the guy for the first time that he's coming to you from an experienced diver and PLH is 11%. So as per regulation, he is reportable.
Yeah.
So that places the onus on me to fill out the form and send that off to the labor.
If you don't report somebody that you've diagnosed with any occupational disease or any occupational disease must be reported by a doctor as soon as it's diagnosed or within 14 days, otherwise you are criminally liable. Occupational injuries, you don't have to report. So a person cuts his finger and they say, doctor, please don't report this, I'll pay you. That's not a legal requirement. The legal requirement for injuries is on the employer to report. So we don't have to report injuries. You can treat them, etc. But if you diagnose an occupational disease, you must report that, yeah.
So my next question is, I can't remember how the forms looks like, but where it asks latest employer.
Yeah.
I mean, what do we just give it to the diver and says you fill out your last employer details there and send them off? Because often, I mean, it comes back and says, but where's the employer's report? Oh.
Yes.
And I mean, is it my duty to chase up Jack's driving operation in the Philippines to provide that report? Or,
Yeah.
I mean,
No, it's not.
To follow that up? Or
Yes,
is
no.
it my responsibility?
No, it's not. I can show you the other option that you have. So to answer Lawrence's question, to submit an occupational disease, you require the first medical report, and then you require the employer's report or the WCL 305. So this is the employee affidavit for an occupational disease when the employer does not timeously submit the employer's report of an accident or of an occupational disease. So then you fill in this report. So then the employee completes this and say this was the employer, and then the nature of the duties that were performed, etc., and they put it
What's the number of that?
305. 305.
SAL 305.
Yeah.
But if it was an overseas employer, it wouldn't help.
Then it might be a problem, yeah. The nature of the business, the employer. Well, I'm not.
Which form do we complete?
So I'm not sure that it won't help because it literally says that if you normally reside, well, I'll have to read the details again. But if you normally work in South Africa and then get injured overseas, there's still compensation. If you normally work here but you get injured in elsewhere, then
So Diagnostic audiogram, journalist before the response.
If you are beyond the threshold of a shift of 10 decibels, if you're beyond that, then you must do a diagnostic audiogram. Yeah, so you can't submit the screening audiogram. You must submit the diagnostic audiogram.
Isn't the cut-off point 30?
30 is for the medical report must have
Labour will accept the occupational health medical practitioner up to 30.
Yeah, but
after 30 it must be a ENT.
but then it's still a diagnostic audiogram that you must do.
Oh yeah, your report.
So you can write a medical report with a diagnostic audiogram. If it's more than 30, then you need a diagnostic audiogram with an ENT report. Yes. Yes. All right, we can discuss.
If you reported, that's your liability done.
Yes, if you've reported it, that's your liability done.
In the complication, then you
Yeah.
stop. You know all these guys are ratified.
Yeah.
You work in here for 3 months or 2 years over there. There's no way you're going to get in a report from the court.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wouldn't go to the trouble of doing that either.
Yes. Yeah. So I normally just submit this thing.
That's it.
Yeah. Remember, submission is there's two submissions. You send the form to the compensation commissioner and one to the Department of Labor, the inspectors. It's a double. Okay. And this information is useful for any occupational disease. I mean, we're now talking about hearing loss, but if you diagnose a pneumoconiosis in the mines, or you diagnose a fungodongolitis because you've scratched with, then that must be reported. 305. Right. But we can discuss this more because I assume you saw some noise exposure yesterday. So in terms of what we do this afternoon, if you've got photos and things,